Trump, the CIA, the FBI, Russia, the DNC, the RNC, and you. Sometimes it's a burden being historically literate. Looking at current events and comparing them to past historical events, and it's breathtaking that so many Trump supporters are practically selling out to the Russians because, of course, their Cheeto-dusted messiah and demigod is sold out to the Russians. And a lot of these people, these same people, or at least the ones old enough to have been aware of international relations and goings on during the Cold War, were no doubt the staunchest of anti-communists. Going all the way back to when Richard Nixon exposed Alger, Stalin's espionage rings in the Manhattan Project, which is where the Soviet H-bomb came from in 1949, and so on. It's amazing how the more things change, the more things stay the same. I mean, the skins can change, the names and even party labels can change, but no matter what happens, there always seems to be a large group of people in this country who are sold out to the Russians. It was the Marxian Democrat left back during the Cold War. Now it's the National Socialist Trumpian left, or Trumpist, or Trumpoid. Pick your appellation. So the CIA, as Caleb Howe wrote on Monday, has stated that Russia tried to influence the 2016 presidential election in the hopes of ensuring that Donald Trump would win and Hillary Clinton would lose. And it apparently has never occurred to any Trump supporter to be a little bit disquieted at why, and to ask themselves, why would an enemy of the United States want Donald Trump to win the 2016 presidential election? It certainly can't be anything good for the United States, but definitely something good for the Russian Federation. And what's good for the Russian Federation is usually not good for the United States. It used to be such a crystal clear, self-evident, common sense, no-brainer, duh, truth. Not anymore, it would seem. Now, that's a short sentence to type, but it covers a whole lot of ground. Would Russia hack us? Yes, they would! And did. Obviously. And did Russia hack us? Yes, they did! Says who? Well, besides the CIA, which is tasked with the espionage thing, there's also the FBI, which is which is tasked with the investigation thing, and senators and congressmen who are on committees about this sort of thing, the Washington Post, which is investigating and reporting on this sort of thing, people from the DNC, people from the GOP with dissent, intelligence experts, computer hacking experts, and, well, pretty much everyone else. You know, people who know about this sort of thing. It's a story that has developed all year, not just in the last few weeks. The Russians hacked us. Not just people in Russia, the Russians. The Russian government. Remember when that was considered an act of war? Not anymore, apparently. Now, Trump and his army of mind-numbed, drone hangers-on loyalists anal linguists and even some run-of-the-mill Republicans just trying to support a Republican president, or trying to support a Republican. No. It's just some run-of-the-mill ignorant Republicans just trying to support a Democrat president are absurdly trying to deny this well-known fact. I've seen it with my own eyes, firsthand, folks. Yes, the word is fact. Russia hacked American computers, American email accounts, and probably hacked the DNC emails that made WikiLeaks a great deal of fun for the last few months. Not just Trumplicans, mind you, but some average Joe Republican politicians and pundits. These are the same Republicans who have been stomping their feet that Russia is a real threat, raising alarms about missile defense, the Ukraine, and more. The same Republicans who were incensed that Romney was laughed at for calling Russia a threat. The same Republicans who have repeated ad nauseum that WikiLeaks is just a publishing arm for the Kremlin. Those same Republicans are suddenly hedging on the idea that Russia would have the wherewithal, gumption, and expertise or motivation to hack emails to mess with our election. Why? Because their hero won that election. And every national interest must be subordinated to the interests of Trump. In their Stockholm syndromized minds. Really, guys? Come on. You look dumb. The Russians hacked us. Even the Department of Homeland Security says so. Here's the quote from DNI itself, Department of National Intelligence. The U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. The recent disclosures of alleged hacked emails on sites like dcleaks.com and WikiLeaks, and by the Guccifer 2.0 online persona, are consistent with the methods and motivations of Russian-directed efforts. And it would hardly be the first Russian hack job. They've been doing that for pretty much the entirety of Barack Obama's second term. These thefts and disclosures are intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. This is right out of the Department of National Intelligence. Such activity is not new to Moscow. The Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Eurasia, for example, to influence public opinion there. We believe, based on the scope and sensitivity of these efforts, that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. Close quote. There are things you have to remember, though. The CIA is a Democrat-heavy agency at the top that is not above politicking. I mean, they didn't like Bush, and they liked Obama, and they don't like Trump. As has been noted at Red State, there's every reason to think that they'd, at worst, exaggerate their knowledge of specific Russian government interference and motive in order to cast doubt on the validity of Trump's election, at best make public things that should be kept secret. It's a well-founded fear. Appointees and bureaucrats are a real thing. And that's where the sticking point is for reasonable people who aren't buying this newest Red Scare. It's the notion of the specificity of Russia's aims. But, and this is a big but, it's not merely the CIA saying this. That Russia has engaged in cyber espionage is generally being reported by all of the intelligence community. The FBI feels that the CIA does not have enough information to draw their very specific conclusion. Mayhap they do, and mayhap they don't. While it is definitely not above Russia to try to influence who is elected, there is no direct evidence that Russia did indeed make specific efforts to ensure that Putin's would-be best friend, long-distance admirer, and kindred spirit, Donald Trump, was elected instead of Hillary for hire Clinton. It's entirely possible that they merely wish to sow discontent and shake America's faith in our voting process. Not that America's faith in its voting process was ever that strong to begin with in this cycle. Certainly the chaos that would result from the election being overturned, or even just an effort to overturn it, based on the idea that our very institutions were compromised by a foreign power, would have ample rewards for Vlad and the gang. Still, despite the CIA's established antipathy to Republicans, there is a broad consensus, something that actually does matter in the field of intelligence. Think of it like multiple fire stations triangulating the location of a forest fire, that Russia hacked American institutions. I mean, the only difference is whether or not you have an interest in Russia hacking a particular American institution, as Trump supporters do. They don't have any problem with Russian hacking as long as it hurt Hillary, any more than the Democrats had any problem with Russian hacking as long as it hurt Trump. Mindless tribalism. Again. Now, I hasten to repeat here that this is the kind of thing Russia is capable of, prone to do, and even slyly winks at doing. The fact that the CIA has not produced one of those TV cop show corkboards with faces and a flowchart connected by yarn is not an indication that there is no evidence. In the field of intelligence, evidence isn't always something you stick a thumbtack in and grimace at over a hot cup of joe in the bullpen. Still, like almost everything this year, the lines dividing the two sides of argument on the right are thin but visible. On the one hand, the Trump-addicted mouthpieces who will say anything in his defense, especially if it's something he already said that they can repeat over and over like some sort of personal empowerment mantra. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Oh, money, Padme Trump. And simply reject outright that Russia tried to influence the election. On another hand, you have people who point out the simple fact that there's no direct evidence that Russia at all tried to win this thing for Donald Trump, a reasonable point of view and definitely more prudent. And then there is the third hand, the one I favor. Even if the Russians tried to influence or disrupt this election, even if they did it with the explicit goal of getting Donald Putin Jr. elected, even granting every possible premise the Democrats are desperately clinging to in their deplorable basket of sore loserism, there is one question that hasn't been answered. Was it enough to change the result? Even if they hacked some voting machines, even if the emails were leaked to discredit Hillary and the Democrats, would that have swayed the election? Parenthetically, I tend to agree with the Clinton campaign that the James Comey letter bringing up email gate again in the last 10 days, I tend to think that pretty much swayed the election to Trump. I don't think there's any reasonable dispute you can make against it. That was the October surprise, the fateful one. But unfortunately, as far as the Russian hack attack, would it have swayed the election? Well, I can't do what I would normally do at this point, which is go to the polling data. Because A, a lot of it was just flat out wrong this year, and B, even though some of it was right, public confidence in polling results pulled a Hindenburg after Trump was elected, and nobody is going to believe anything it says anyway. So I'm just going to rely on that rarest of commodities in this day and age, common sense. Personal judgment and position as an obsessed 24/7 consumer of every tiniest morsel of election news this year and say, well, obviously, hell no. For the exact same reason that all these Alex Jones, Joe Scarafone, InfoWars, paranoid tinfoil hat nut jobs who claimed, well, and Trump would be in that category since he claimed that 3 million people illegally voted for Hillary Clinton. That was the only reason he didn't win the popular vote, too. But the argument is the same argument as to why voter fraud cannot throw a national election unless it's within 100 votes in one state like it was back in 2000. You know, the same argument as well. Mitt Romney really won in 2012, but massive Democrat voter fraud stole the election. Oh, it didn't. There is a limit to how much left-wing voter fraud can accomplish. It just is. I mean, look at this pathetic post-election Jill Stein swindled recount campaign in really the only three states that mattered: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Those three states flipping red is what turned the election for Donald Trump. I mean, add it up. 10, 28, 38, and 30. He had 306 electoral votes, minus 38, 268. He flipped Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That's why Trump won. And what did the Jill Stein-fueled recount campaign accomplish? Well, in Wisconsin, it actually increased Trump's margin of victory. I mean, the combined Trump margin of victory in those three states was something like 100,000 votes. Voter fraud could not have overturned that. The Democrats' well-known skill and talent for recounting their way to victory couldn't overturn it. And a Russian cyber attack could not have flipped 100,000 votes from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. It just, none of that holds water. None of that is doable. None of it is practical because the margin was too large. It just wasn't enough. It could never have been enough. They couldn't possibly do enough. If there was voter fraud, it wasn't enough to change the outcome because it wasn't close enough. Remember Hugh Hewitt's book from a decade ago. If it's not close, they can't cheat their way to victory. If there was voting machine tampering, it just wasn't enough to sway the outcome. Period. And as for the leaked emails being a sufficient disruption to change public opinion so substantially that Hillary lost the election because of it, well, I think there's some plausibility to it. But, so what? What goes around comes around. The notion that those heavily editorialized in her favor tidbits of information being periodically mentioned on some of the news networks somehow altered the eventual outcome of the election in the face of wall-to-wall Donald Trump as the unholy offspring of Hitler and Beelzebub, which actually is within the realm of plausibility. Media blitzkrieg against him is utterly laughable. Look, I'm as keen to bash Batty Donald as the next guy, but you have to be equally nuts if you think that the comparatively small amount of negative coverage of Hillary was given, except for the Comey letter in the last 10 days, was given as anything more than a drop of water in the raging sea of anti-Trump coverage. The idea that such a drop would have more impact than the sea is preposterous. So no, Russia didn't hand the election to Trump, though they tried. I'm fine with the investigation. There should be an investigation. I applaud it, in fact. Expose the Ruskies and their machinations. Let's out the once and future Soviets as our foes. Good, do it. I can't imagine why anyone would object, although Trump supporters do. And let's praise both the CIA and the FBI for being on top of this. Let's not make fools of ourselves claiming the Russians didn't mess with an election they clearly messed with. But in the name of all that is logical, don't try to sell us the idiotic idea that Russia turned this thing for Trump. They tried, but they couldn't have. It's just not credible. But then neither are the Democrats. And trust me, I know, I saw it in their leaked emails. So this holds up well, right?
President a chance.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back, because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s, just like the social policies of the 1950s and the economic policies of the 1920s.
Here's the CIA, according to reports last Friday. This is from the Washington Post. The CIA has concluded in a secret assessment that Russia intervened in the 2016 election to help Donald Trump win the presidency, rather than just to undermine confidence in the U.S. electoral system, according to officials briefed on the matter. Intelligence agencies have identified individuals with connections to the Russian government who provided WikiLeaks with thousands of hacked emails from the Democrat National Committee and others, including Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, according to U.S. officials. Those officials described the individuals as actors known to the intelligence community and part of a wider Russian operation to boost Trump and hurt Mrs. Clinton's chances. It is the assessment of the intelligence community that Russia's goal here was to favor one candidate over the other to help Trump get elected, said a senior U.S. official briefed on an intelligence presentation made to U.S. senators. That's the consensus view, close quote, which should make any Trump supporter pause and wonder, is this a good thing that they want our guy to win? That should have given all Trump supporters pause, my friends. There's just no question about it. Now, this is an extraordinary conclusion, and one that comes after Russia has spent years defying the United States and exerting its will abroad, invading Ukraine, menacing the Baltics, and partnering with Iran to tip the balance of power in Syria. Has there ever been a greater mismatch between the extent of the threat and a president's dismissal than Obama's tone in 2012? It's worse even than declaring ISIS the JV team, because in mocking Mitt Romney, Obama was minimizing the strength and influence of a nuclear-armed great power with a long history of antagonism to the United States. This is an important moment. Republicans who minimize the CIA assessment are exposing their own hypocrisy. Can you imagine the GOP outcry if a similar assessment was made after Hillary Clinton won the election, with a margin of less than 100,000 votes in key states? There would be a near meltdown on talk radio, Fox News, and online. A president-elect who seeks to lead all Americans, and not just double down with his mindless partisan base, should proactively enlist the president Obama in a joint call for a complete, thorough, and bipartisan investigation of Russian efforts, complete with an analysis of any American strategic, intelligence, or defense failures that may have left our nation more vulnerable to Russian influence. But then anybody who thinks that Donald Trump, who is every bit the strutting, megalomaniacal, cosmic narcissist that Obama is going to pursue that. A bipartisan investigation of what? It didn't put him in office, but it was somebody who was trying to help him and help his own interest. Do you think Trump's going to pursue such an investigation? No, he is not. Indeed. Instead, Trump says this, quote, "These are the same people that said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The election ended a long time ago in one of the biggest electoral college victories in history." No, actually, it was 46th out of 58. You're not 50. It was not. It was bottom quarter. Bottom quarter, it was not anywhere close. 306. That doesn't even come close to Obama's 2 victories or either of Bill Clinton's 2 victories. Although it was the biggest Republican margin since 1988, for whatever that's worth. And at that, I mean, George H.W. Bush in 1988 won 426 electoral votes. Trump only 306. So, but Trump's ego just enables him to see things as he wants to see them rather than as they are, and it trickles down to his mindless drone supporters too. Anyway, to finish with the Trump quote here. It's now time to move on and make America great again. Well, instead, there are now reports that he settled on Rex Tillerson for Secretary of State, a man with very close and very friendly ties to the Putin government. Quote, among those considered for the post, Tillerson has perhaps the closest ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, a veritable Russian agent in our midst. Having negotiated a 2011 energy partnership deal with Russia that Putin said could eventually be worth as much as $500 billion. In 2012, the Kremlin bestowed the country's Order of Friendship decoration on Tillerson. That doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence. I mean, say what you will about Mitt Romney, he has a clear-eyed... He knows the real geopolitical situation. He would have been a very capable Secretary of State, which of course is why Trump didn't select him. He wanted a Putin sycophant, just like he's a Putin sycophant. Now there is time for Trump to reverse course, which he won't, to call for an investigation into Russian activities, which he won't, and to nominate a Secretary of State who's known for clearly understanding Russian intentions and the extent of Russian aggression, which he had in Mitt Romney, but he was never going to select him. Trump is president of an entire nation, not just the leader of his movement, but that's not how he sees it, or his movement. And he needs to move quickly to acknowledge that millions of Americans are feeling exactly as Republicans would if the roles were reversed, but he doesn't give a shit about those millions of Americans who don't bow down to him. Yes, the 80s have called. They have their foreign policy back. The Russians know it. Obama finally knows it. Does Trump? Hell no! David French continued the plea for sanity, bipartisan sanity, at the corner on Monday at nationalreview.com. Now let's get this out of the way first and foremost. While there is plenty of evidence that Russia meddled in the 2016 U.S. presidential election for the sake of sowing doubt and uncertainty, undermining the then likely future president, Hillary, or trying to help elect Trump, there is yet zero evidence that Russian intelligence operations actually conclusively influenced the outcome. There is as yet zero evidence that the election itself was illegitimate. In fact, to the contrary, Russian meddling was disclosed, discussed, and debated during the campaign. We did not yet know Russian intent, and still don't, but Russian actions, well, we have a pretty good idea. But Russian actions were widely known. Unless we gain compelling evidence to the contrary, there is nothing illegitimate about Trump's win. But that does not mean that Putin hasn't gained a comprehensive operational victory. Through years of effort and exploitation of profound American divisions and weaknesses, he's accomplished the following. Number one, he undermined confidence in the Democrat presidential nominee with a big assist from Hillary herself. Yes, the reset was a disaster. Yes, her foreign policy failed. But the problems with Mrs. Clinton went beyond simple incompetence. Never forget this story from the New York Times involving the sale of 20% 20% of our uranium assets to a Russian-controlled corporation. Here's a quote from that story. Beyond mines in Kazakhstan that are among the most lucrative in the world, the sale gave the Russians control of 1/5 of all uranium production capacity in the United States. Since uranium is considered a strategic asset with implications for national security, the deal had to be approved by a committee composed of representatives from a number of United States government agencies. Among the agencies that eventually signed off was the State Commissariat, then headed by Hillary Rodham Clinton. As the Russians gradually assumed control of Uranium-1 in 3 separate transactions from 2009 to 2013, Canadian records show a flow of cash made its way to the Clinton Foundation. Uranium-1's chairman used his family foundation to make 4 donations totaling $2.35 million. Those contributions were not publicly disclosed by the Clintons, despite an agreement Mrs. Clinton had struck with the Obama White House to publicly identify all donors. Other people with ties to the company made donations as well. And now they'll be making them to the Trump Foundation. And shortly after the Russians announced their intention to acquire a majority stake in Uranium-1, Bill Clinton received $500,000 for a Moscow speech from a Russian investment bank with links to the Kremlin that was promoting Uranium-1 stock. Surprise, surprise, surprise! The State Commissariat approved the deal. Mrs. Clinton opportunism and greed struck again. Number 2. Putin undermined confidence in the Republican presidential nominee with a big assist from Trump himself. At the same time that Republican partisans were expressing alarm at justifiable Hillary outrages, like the uranium sale above and her utterly reckless handling of classified information, all too many Republicans were turning a blind eye to truly disturbing developments within and without the Trump campaign. Russian Twitter trolls piled on Trump critics and artificially created pro-Trump trends. Read Louise Mensch's extraordinary pre-election Heat Street story to see how. In October, it was widely reported, again, this is pre-election, that Russia was behind the WikiLeaks hacks and the subsequent drip of unflattering information into the public realm. A complete list of Russian actions that favored Trump will come at a later time, but their pro-Trump slant was open and obvious. Moreover, the Trump campaign did nothing to dissuade the belief that it was too close to Putin. Trump repeatedly praised Putin, encouraged Russia to hack more emails because it was helping him in the campaign, absurdly and without evidence tried to cast doubt on claims of Russian meddling, and for a time hired a man to run his campaign, Paul Manafort, who may have received millions of dollars in off-books cash transactions with a pro-Russia political party. Handwritten ledgers, according to the New York Times, show $12.7 million in undisclosed cash payments designated for Manafort from Mr. Yanukovych's pro-Russian political party from 2007 to 2012. That would be in Ukraine. According to Ukraine's newly formed National Anti-Corruption Bureau, investigators assert that the disbursements were part of an illegal off-the-books system whose recipients also included election officials. American election officials, in other words. Manafort later left the campaign, and there are now reports that the FBI is conducting a preliminary inquiry into his foreign business dealings. One more Trump scandal soon to erupt. Not even in office yet. Number 3. Putin exposed legions of commentators and politicians as pure partisan hacks. The Democrat establishment praised Obama's sick burn of Mitt Romney when he dismissed Romney's warnings about Russia and declared in a 2012 presidential debate that the 1980s are calling, they want their foreign policy back. But it turns out that Romney was right. Russia is our primary geopolitical rival, and it has run one of the more successful disinformation operations I've ever seen on Obama's watch and right under Obama's nose. And to Donald Trump's benefit. At the same time, Trump operatives and their trained SEALs and conservative media are so busy basking in the glow of victory that they're neglecting the fact that if the shoe was on the other foot, and you Trumplicans know this damn well to be true, if similar evidence of pro-Hillary Russian interference was present in the aftermath of a Hillary victory, they would be howling at the top of their own partisan lungs. You know it's true. They would call the election illegitimate. You know it's true, Trump supporters. They would be calling Hillary a Manchurian candidate. They would be screaming not just for an independent investigation, but for electors to switch their votes. You know this is true, Trumplicans. You absolutely know it. Mindless tribalism. Number 4, Putin actually did undermine American faith in the American government. Right now, there are millions upon millions of Americans who believe, to the bottom of their flinty, black, oily little hearts, that the 2016 election was fundamentally illegitimate. Putin saw an America more divided and distrustful than any time in modern history, and he pushed precisely on the right pressure point. Russian hacks and Twitter bots have to represent one of the most cost-effective intelligence expenditures in modern memory. With remarkably little effort, he cast an election in doubt and exacerbated partisan political divisions. At this point, there has to be an investigation of Russian influence on the 2016 election, and of Russian efforts to influence American politics and discourse more broadly. And do you think that Trump is going to carry on that investigation when he benefited from Russian efforts to influence the election? Dream on, pal. It would have to be bipartisan at least and independent at best. It's never going to get off the ground. Trump won't allow it. Probably has orders from Putin to that effect. And if it were to confirm what virtually every intelligence agency contends, that Russia at the very least was attempting to act as a disruptive force, then there has to be a decisive American response that there will never be because Trump benefited from this. Even if it didn't get him elected, he still benefited from it. And besides, he wants to keep that as an ace in the hole for 2020. Even in the best of circumstances, Russian interference would be intolerable, but we're far from the best of circumstances. America is polarized and awash in partisan outrage. Putin has, well, Trump has made it worse, and Putin helped him do it. And we cap off this video with our longtime friend and ally, Jonah Goldberg, who makes the point, which has been the theme of this video, that while Trump won the election fair and square, that doesn't mean the Russians played no part. They did not decide the election, but they tried to. And their attempt to influence it merits serious attention from all parties, which it will never receive. from President Trump. So, of course, Trump thinks it's ridiculous to claim the Russians rigged the election for him, because he only cared about rigged elections if the election didn't go his way. He was more than happy to have it rigged in his favor. As I pointed out throughout the campaign, even if Vladimir Putin confessed to the crime on Russia today, Trump would not believe it, because to do so was not in his nature, which is another way of saying his ego would never permit it. It would never permit him to even make that internal realization or acknowledgement. Now, I don't want to shock the reader, the listener, the audience here, but Trump has a very high opinion of himself and a tendency to reject evidence that contradicts that opinion, combined with an eagerness to find corroboration of his self-regard wherever possible. In other words, he's a strutting, megalomaniacal, cosmic narcissist, just like Obama. For instance, during the campaign, Trump could never concede that online polls weren't scientific, because the results of these polls confirmed that Trump was terrific, fabulous, and tremendous. Ego, the living planet, is a Marvel reference that comes to mind. Yeah, Trump's going to be in Guardians of the Galaxies too. It won't be Kurt Russell, it'll be Trump playing Ego, the living planet, except they won't have to do any CGI for that one. So there was nothing shocking about Trump's behavior over the weekend. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace asked, according to the Washington Post, the CIA has concluded that Russia intervened in the election to help you win the presidency. Your reaction? And of course, as we already discussed, Trump's response was, quote, I think it's ridiculous. I think it's just another excuse. I don't believe it. I don't know why, and I think it's just, they talked about all sorts of things. Every week, it's another excuse. We had a massive landslide victory. No, you didn't have a massive landslide. You won. You didn't have a massive landslide. Victory, as you know, in the Electoral College. I guess the final numbers are now at 306, which is not a landslide. Sorry, it's not a landslide. No, I don't believe that at all, because he doesn't want to believe it. See? Wallace asked about a news report about a reported CIA finding which is corroborated by the entire U.S. intelligence community. And all Trump heard was, you didn't really win the election because of Russia. And again, for your information, Trump's Electoral College victory ranks as I said earlier, the 46th biggest out of 58. Now, the good news for Trump is that no credible source has claimed that the Russians won the election for him, that their intervention and meddling was decisive. To believe that, you'd have to think that the Russians tricked Mrs. Clinton into deploying her campaign resources disastrously. Because, her narcissistic complacency was stratospheric as well. That's what led her to deploy her campaign resources disastrously. She wanted to she thought she was going to sweep the Electoral College anyway, and she was going to run up a huge popular vote margin in order to, guess what, have a mandate. No, Putin didn't convince her to set up her stealth server. And Putin didn't encourage her to give a lackluster performance on the campaign trail. That was all the Democrats that did that. They should have known what they were getting when they nominated her. How did the Russians get Mrs. Clinton to ignore Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania? But countless credible sources have said that the Kremlin interfered with our election. Trump and his team are foolish and irresponsible to rain scorn on that. But the New York Times reported that the Russians also hacked the Republican National Committee servers but didn't leak the results. Campaign aide Sean Spicer tweeted, "Don't miss tomorrow's Sanger New York Times exclusive interview with Elvis riding his unicorn on a rainbow with Santa." Well, the Time story is not nearly as dispositive as Democrats claim, but it is hardly the stuff of psychedelic fantasy. The real debate is over whether the Russian meddling, which echoes similar meddling across Europe, was intended to get Trump elected or simply to erode confidence in the small d democratic process. I fail to see how this is an either-or choice. The hacking could have started with mere mischief in mind and evolved into a pro-Trump effort by the end. Most experts, including those on Trump's team, didn't expect to win, contrary to a lot of post-election spin, and it's doubtful that Russia's psephologists are that much better than ours. So the most likely goal for the Russians was to set up a defeated Trump to denounce the validity of the election and the integrity of the political process, which he was doing right up until the moment he won. And now it's inviolable and pristine and landslide and... But then Trump won on the merits. The great irony is that the Democrats and the media, pardon the redundancy, which not long ago were denouncing any suggestion that the system is rigged, are now echoing the very talking points Putin wants. Which is why the 2016 election was always a win-win for Vladimir Putin. Because whoever won was going to be in his back pocket, taking orders from him and acting as the conduit for Vladimir Putin's conduct of U.S. foreign policy. The difference between Trump and Mrs. Clinton is that if Mrs. Clinton had won, Putin would have had to pay for that access. With Trump, it comes for free. It's a poisonous situation all around. Trump refuses to budge on his claim to a glorious, massive, delusional victory, or back off of his disturbing Putin-philia. Democrats and much of the media won't grapple with the fact that Mrs. Clinton lost fair and square, and they are in desperate pursuit of excuses to reject Trump's legitimacy. Some are even working to give electors an intelligence briefing before they have to vote, presumably in an effort to overturn the election. And, you know, some states require their electors to support the candidate that carried their state. Others don't. Every state's different in that regard. But can you imagine if the left, if the Democrats, pardon the redundancy, somehow got 38 electors to switch sides? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Trump wins the election legitimately. I mean, the Russians did their best to help him, but he would have won it without their help. And then 38 electors just flip over and vote for Hillary anyway. Can you imagine? It's not going to happen, but can you imagine what I'm not saying I'm rooting for it either. It shouldn't happen. Trump won fair and square. But can you imagine what would ensue if that happened? Oh, my Lord. And boy, Putin would jizz himself. He really would, man. See, that's why I say, no matter how this election turned out, Putin's the big winner. That's not a good thing for the United States. The only hope is that after Trump has been sworn in, both sides can revisit the issue of Putin's clearly insidious agenda without the specter of a do-over coloring everything people say and everything Trump hears. But if that's the only hope, then it is a woefully forlorn one. Because this country is now being ruled from and by the Kremlin.